the settlement of the Czechoslovakian problem, which has now been achieved, is, in my view, only the prelude to a larger settlement in which all Europe may find peace. This morning, I had another talk with the German Chancellor, Herr Hitler. And here is the paper which bears his name upon it as well as mine. Some of you perhaps have already heard what it contains, but I would just like to read it to you. We, the German Führer and Chancellor, and the British Prime Minister have had a further meeting today and are agreed in recognizing that the question of Anglo-German relations is of the first importance for the two countries and for Europe. We regard the agreement signed last night and the Anglo-German naval agreement as symbolic of the desire of our two peoples never to go to war with one another again.
So we're here today at James Lloyd's house. He's the grandson of Neville Chamberlain, and I've come to talk to him about my new book, Neville Chamberlain's Legacy, for the Warwick Words History Festival. Firstly, James, thank you so much for agreeing to be interviewed for the Warwick Words History Festival.
It's a pleasure.
And you know, it would have been lovely to have been there in person, wouldn't it? But I think we're going to have to do this film as a substitute. So,
indeed.
But that's the sign of the times. Really. So, James, I suppose an obvious first question is: tell me about the memories that you've got of your grandfather.
Right. Well, of course, I was only 4 in 1940 when he died. So, although I do have one or two memories, they're a bit hazy. But I think I've sort of hung on to them. And they are mainly in London. I do remember going to 10 Downing Street as a pretty small child, and being held up at a window overlooking a parade on Horse Guards, which obviously made quite an impression on me. I also remember going to Chequers for Christmas. I think it must have been in December 1939. And I can specifically remember my grandfather playing with me and pushing me around the grounds a bit on a toy horse or something of that nature at Chequers. I also remember back in Birmingham playing with a doll. Oh. And here it is. This is Nick's doll.
It is my doll, yes.
Yes. It's not a very good likeness,
no.
But it brings back memories again with dolls of other other politicians of the time, I think. And perhaps my final memory would be from our house in Calthorpe Road, Edgbaston, now demolished, going down the narrow garden behind the house and through a door at the back into Harborne Road, and watching my grandfather come past in his car on his way, I think probably to making a speech in the town hall, and waving to him and getting a wave back. I remember that. I think there were quite a number of people in Harborne Road there to see him go, because he was very popular in Birmingham, of course.
He was.
So those are my main memories.
Fantastic.
But I have other quite good impressions of him, because within a few months of his death, my father wrote a piece for me and my sister describing him and many of his qualities. And I've drawn on that to bolster my impressions of my grandfather as a person. There's not much politics in what my father wrote, but no. As a person, it's great.
I suppose the most important question really is, do you think How do you think history has treated your grandfather?
Well, for most of the 80 years since he died, very poorly. And I think his political reputation has been distorted, largely due to the publication of the polemic Guilty Men, which came out, was it at the beginning of the war? I think it was. Or,
yes, that's right. Yeah.
Yes. And of course from Winston Churchill's war memoirs, where he was, in my opinion, excessively unkind to my grandfather, and surprisingly so, because in the latter year and a half of his life they worked together very closely and admired each other very much. But more recently, I think things are changing, and a much more balanced view of my grandfather is emerging. He had many achievements before he became PM, which you, Nick, in your book have written about. And I think he always thought of himself primarily as a social reformer, politically, and his work in the 1920s in that area was very much a forerunner of the social reforms that came in after the war. And more recently, there have been many books written about him, of course, but the more recent histories, particularly I'm thinking of a fine biography by Robert Self, as well as your book, and other works that have tried to put forward a very balanced view of his achievements. And then, of course, perhaps we shall talk about this a little bit more, there's his interests as a naturalist, which was a great passion of his. And I don't think the public at large are aware either of his personal interests. He was a very cultured man, and of his social reforming work. It's all Munich and appeasement, and that has been misinterpreted.
Do you think one of the reasons that and I agree with that, but it's also come about, is that he never had a chance to put his point of view forward? So, because of course he died in November 1940, and he had he have lived, do you think things might have been slightly different?
I think so. I mean, I think he would have taken opportunities, certainly if he'd lived to the end of the war, to put forward his policies as Prime Minister, or to explain his policies as Prime Minister himself. I mean, it's not well known that appeasement was only one half of his policy. He always talked in his letters about his double policy, which was appeasement or seeking peace on one side and rearmament on the other. And his work in the field of rearmament was certainly a major contributory factor to the success of the Battle of Britain. And he, in fact, devoted, as Chancellor of the Exchequer and Prime Minister, as much as 50% of GDP to rearmament. And that's a very little known fact.
So yeah, so if we just sort of go back a little bit, James, to his time as Minister for Health and Chancellor of the Exchequer, what do you think he achieved in those two roles?
Well, as Minister of Health, and we must remember that the Ministry of Health was a very wide-ranging brief, which covered housing, planning, pensions, and medical issues. He put through Parliament a huge series of bills. He spoke frequently about issues that are actually brought to fruition in later legislation, such as the Green Belt and garden cities. I think he got great personal satisfaction in all he achieved as Minister of Health. As Chancellor, he became Chancellor in 1933, was it?
Three. Yeah.
Yes, when the economy was in a pretty dire state. And I think was generally recognised as having been a very successful Chancellor who turned the economy around, fortunately, because I think, as I've said earlier, resources were needed, particularly for rearmament, that probably were not there in the early 1930s.
Thank you, James. So if I could take you right back to Neville's childhood then, and I think one of the defining things about that was obviously his mother dying quite early. Do you want to say a little bit about that, and perhaps how you think it affected him?
I think the death of his mother, when he must have been about 6, affected all the family hugely. He missed his mother, and he was brought up by, I think, a rather difficult aunt. So I'm sure that the lack of a mother's love was a very strong influence on him as a personality. And of course it affected his father, Joseph Chamberlain, hugely as well. And as a result of the death of his mother, and indeed of his half-brother Austin and Beatrice's mother before that, turned his father in those years into a rather distant character, I think. So he had less than an ideal childhood, and not a very happy school years either. So I think that perhaps he was a shy man, and that might have been an influence on the fact of the shyness.
Okay, thank you. And I suppose this is a good point to bring in Uncle George. He had, of course, he had an uncle, George Kendrick. Is that right? On which side? It was on his
mother's side.
On his mother's side. That's
yes.
right. Who sort of he didn't have any children of his own, as I understand it, and he was a very keen lepidopterist, wasn't he?
He
very
was.
into moths and butterflies, and he took Neville under his wing, didn't he?
He did. I might actually just read to you a little passage here from this piece that my father wrote in about Neville. In boyhood and as a young man, Neville had a great interest in butterflies and moths and all kinds of insects. He would often go for expeditions into the Wye Forest, Chadsley Woods and other places with Sir George Kenrick, who had the same interests. He made a large collection of British butterflies and moths, which was kept in a cabinet in his study at Westbourne. That was his home in Birmingham. And shortly before his death, he gave it to the Birmingham Museum. He retained this interest and his detailed knowledge all his life. And then there's a rather nice little sentence here towards the end. After the war began, we, that would be my parents, were crossing the great north lawn at Chequers, and and examining a recently planted Judas tree, when he pointed to an insect on a leaf and said, "Look, Phlogophora meticulosa," and made us all laugh.
I'll have to look up what the common name for that is, but I don't know. But that, and I suppose you very kindly referred to the book, but that love of natural history was something that I suppose ran throughout his life and fascinated me, because I'm a naturalist, and it was interesting because he of course took it with him as a young man to the Bahamas, and then throughout his political career, and of course into Downing Street as well. And did you, as a result of reading the book, did you learn anything new about that aspect of his personality?
Oh yes, I'm sure I did. I knew from this piece my father wrote and what my mother in particular told me of his passion for all things natural history, and which stemmed, I think, from, as a young man, he read Darwin's books and was a huge admirer of Charles Darwin, and he had a lot of scientific and books in his library in Birmingham. Did I learn something new? I wasn't, I think, aware of his particular conservation achievements, and you talk in the book about his membership of CPRE, and his work in setting up the wildlife trusts. That's I think that was news to me. Okay. So I enjoyed very much that. I didn't know of Gilbert Collett.
No. Okay. Yes.
I don't think I'd ever heard of him until your book came out, and that was interesting too.
I thought that was fascinating because, of course, he wrote, when he became Prime Minister, he wrote this piece for the Countryman.
Yes, I've got that.
Yes, in which, again, which he talked about a leopard moth he found in the garden and the bird boxes. But as a result of that, Gilbert Collett got in contact with him. I suppose what I found so amazing was that he, he would go for a walk every day around St James's Park. That was his respite, wasn't it? From the pressure, the almost unbearable burden he had to deal with in Downing Street in the run up to the war. But I think what the letters for Collett really showed me was that he would pop out if there was something really rare had turned up. And it's just incredible to think of it, isn't it?
It is. Yes, you can't imagine a modern Prime Minister having the time or probably the interest to do that.
And I suppose for me also it was, he continued to do that even after we declared war. So if Collett said that there was a common sandpiper or scorp or something on the lake, however busy, and he was incredibly busy, wasn't it? He would find time, wouldn't he?
I think, is it in your book you say that his security officers were appalled
exasperated, I think was the word I used.
Yes.
And I think the funny thing looking back is just as well the Germans didn't know about that, because it would have been quite easy, wouldn't it, to have put someone in St James's Park and waited. But just tell me a little bit about, because that for me was all about maintaining his mental health, and which of course wasn't an issue talked about then, but is something that we're very aware of. And because he was under, after Munich, he was in a very difficult position, wasn't he?
In what sense, Nick, do you mean?
I just mean in terms of I think that he talks about in the book. He says it's very difficult for anybody else to understand the atmosphere in Downing street.
Oh, right.
As Hitler did one thing after another, and we were continually reacting to it.
Right. Yes. I mean, I think most of his premiership was really very stressful.
Yes.
But I suppose, yes, particularly after Munich and the way in which his hopes of what might happen after Munich turned to dust was certainly difficult.
So we need to talk about Munich, I think, for a little bit, James. And just, it was obviously very important for him to go the extra mile and then another one for peace. Just tell me how you think that he went about that process.
Well, I think this probably goes back to long before he became Prime Minister. There were remarks made subsequently that Neville Chamberlain knew nothing about foreign policy,
Yes.
whereas I think he knew a lot about foreign policy and he was widely travelled.
He was.
And I think that from sort of mid-30s onwards, what he was trying to achieve was a peaceful settlement in Europe as a whole. Or what he wanted to achieve was a peaceful settlement. And so I think he was a politician of steely determination. And I think he knew probably from then right through till March 1939 that his role was to do everything in his power to achieve that peaceful settlement. I don't think he was taken in by Hitler. He refers to him frequently as a lunatic.
Yes, he uses some choice words about him, doesn't he?
Or a mad dog, I think, on occasion too. So I think Munich and what came after was all part of a long-held ambition on Neville's part.
Okay. And of course the public were solidly behind him, weren't they?
They were. He deeply regretted having used the phrase peace in our time.
Yes.
And I think he said so in the House of Commons afterwards.
He did afterwards, absolutely.
But those words, which I think someone suggested he used, came out in a very emotional moment.
Yes.
When, as you say, he was being cheered right, left and centre down the streets of London and in Downing Street. That was a big mistake.
Okay. But the public responded to Peace for Our Time with they were so relieved, and these letters and in particular these gifts poured into Downing Street, didn't they? 40,000 within a few weeks from all over the world, and some amazing gifts were given to him. Do you want to say a little bit about? And I think some of those gifts are still within the family, aren't they? So,
well, one in particular is the Blüthner family in Germany gave him a grand Blüthner piano, a wonderful instrument, which I'm not sure if nowadays he would have been allowed to keep.
No, I think that. I think these days they remember.
But those were different times.
Yes.
And indeed, the piano was kept. And after my grandfather's death, passed to my mother, who was herself a very good pianist. She studied in Paris and was close to professional standard, I think. And she played that piano for years. But towards the end of her life, she donated it to the University of Birmingham, where it remained for many years. But became, I think, rather neglected in the latter time, and it was discovered, locked away somewhere in the university, and brought to the notice of my sister, who is also a pianist, and we were very happy that the piano was actually, she was allowed to take it and get it restored and keep it. And so it's back in the family,
Right.
In my sister's home.
Okay. In the sort of weeks and months after Munich, Chamberlain's popularity was at its zenith. Really, it was he was, but increasingly, while the public remained with him, Parliament sort of turned, didn't it? And that must have been a very difficult time for him.
It was. You're talking particularly about the sort of post-Munich up to the outbreak of war period.
Yes.
Yes. I think that was difficult, but I've mentioned he was a steely and determined person, and he was also, some say he was an arrogant man. I don't think he was an arrogant man, but he was a very self-confident man. And I think he didn't allow the difficulties to affect him too much. I think it became a rather different situation after the outbreak of war. He never really thought of himself as a wartime prime minister, and I think when the time for resignation came in May 1940, I think he was quite relieved.
Okay, that's interesting. We should talk a little bit about his wife Annie and the support, your grandmother, the support that she gave to him. Yes, there's a fantastic picture of her just up there. He married relatively late, but sort of found in her the real love of his life, didn't he? How important was she to him, do you think?
Hugely important. She was a very charming person. I mean, I knew her well because she died in 1965, I think it was. Or yes. So I knew her well. She was a wholly delightful person. Irish, rather inconsequential in many ways, but full of charm. Everybody loved her, and she was very much loved too in Birmingham, where she used to do a lot of canvassing for Neville. I think she had quite a lot of ill health during their married life together, but he adored her and she adored him. It was a very good marriage.
Very good marriage.
And she was an enormous support.
Okay, and I suppose she also did a huge amount during the First World War, didn't she? She was in charge of a committee that was supplying all the troops from Birmingham with all the and I think it's in the book. It was quite incredible, the responsibility that she took on then.
Yes.
He was mayor. I mean, she was that, and she continued that throughout her political life, didn't she? That sort of level of support behind the scenes.
She did. She did.
And she must have been a little bit upset as well, was she, about how he was sort of portrayed? Because as you said, she did for quite a long time after the war.
She did. I think she and my mother and my uncle, all had a very difficult time in really right up to the. Well, my uncle died young too. I mean, he died in 1965, I think it was. So they had to put up with all the criticism, some of it quite malicious criticism, But they, all three of them, always did all they could to speak for Neville's policies and for his personality too. My mother did quite a lot of television broadcasting interviews.
Yeah.
But I'm sorry that all of them have not been able to see how his reputation has blossomed in more recent years.
Okay. And as you say, there's been a new sort of appreciation of the efforts that he went to prevent war, and his wider role, as particularly as we discussed in the conservation movement. As I understand it, there is a campaign to get a memorial to him in both in Birmingham and one in St James's Park.
Yes, there is. And I know you're very much involved in the St James's Park one. It would be wonderful if both memorials are able to come to fruition. I think the discussions in Birmingham in particular have come to a bit of a halt through the coronavirus situation. There was a hope that a memorial would be ready for the 80th anniversary of Neville's death in November. It doesn't look as though that's going to happen. No. But after all, he was the only Prime Minister that Birmingham has produced, and it's right and proper that there should be a memorial there to him. Not necessarily a statue, but something. And yes, you've already referred to his daily walks in St James's Park and his interest in the natural history there, particularly the birds. And it would be a highly appropriate place to have something remembering his interests. And hopefully that too would play its part in giving people a better understanding of the whole man, rather than just the appeaser.
Absolutely. Yeah. You got some high-level support for that. I know Lord Lexton, who's the Conservative Party's historian, is very supportive of this and is driving the campaign in Birmingham.
Yes, he is.
We've had the TV naturalist Chris Packham has said that he supports the idea, and both, of course, the CPRE and the Wildlife Trusts as well.
Yes.
So, do you think it's what would you say to the current government about why this was important, that we should try and honour him?
Well, I think increasingly he is being seen. I owe something here to Lord Lexton too, I think, who's written a very good booklet about Neville, called Redressing the Balance. And I think he is increasingly seen not as a weak Prime Minister, but as, by some historians, as a great Prime Minister. And I think people who've played such a significant role in history should have their memorials.
And James, I just wanted to thank you so much for allowing us here today and for telling us about your memories of your grandfather, Neville Chamberlain. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nick.